Hello friends, in the drama series we have today the lecture of Professor Payal Nagpal, who teaches in the Department of English, Janaki Devi Memorial College, Delhi University. We have the subject, the theatre of the absurd, and the author who will be at the center of this discussion would be Ionesco, and the play that will be focused upon is Rhinoceros. Before I request Professor Payal Nagpal to speak, let me make one or two initial comments about the topic that we have for discussion. For instance, there is a term that is generally used in the 20th century drama, and the term is called the theatre of the absurd. Now, there are two things in it. One is that it is theatre, which means it's not drama, and secondly, exclusively that is, and secondly that it's a theatre of the absurd, and such words are not common in English critical parlance. It's a new word. It must have been coined and given a kind of interpretive space in the 20th century, and that which is absurd. What is this word doing in the aesthetics of literature? So that's the first query. Of course, those who are in MA in English or who have an advanced course in literature would understand the term, but there might be some newcomers also. So they would like to know as to how, the word absurd has been accepted as an important word in the modern critical lexicon. So that's one query which query I'm making to myself, and I want to understand as to why the absurd becomes the center of attraction for literary criticism. And the second thing is that Ionesco, who is a French playwright, is not talking perhaps about human beings, but he's talking about the rhinos, and what made him do it, and what does he exactly mean by rhinoceros as a symbol of something in this play. So I have these general queries, which will be the queries of the undergraduates among the audience. So I would request her to just talk a little about these two terms, and then focus upon the playwright and the play. So Professor Payal Nagpal, you're welcome, and please give this initial comment, and then you might begin.
Thank you, Professor Prakash. And I think you gave us two very, very important, very apt phrases here. One is the aesthetics of literature and how the absurd is to be situated there. And the lexicon of criticism. So I think these two ideas will help us understand and position the term absurd. So the 20th century, of course, is known for a lot of avant-garde movements, and movements that involved a lot of experimentation, movements that allowed thinkers, performers, artists, everyone to look for new ways of expression. But when we come to the absurd, we are primarily talking about the post-Second World War scenario. And in this world, everything around seemed extremely chaotic. Absurd means that it is not possible to make sense of things. So the writers, and especially the playwrights, of the time, they found themselves to be at a complete loss about how to make sense of things. And this is what they articulate within the whole structure of the theatre of the absurd, because the world is no longer making sense, and science, invention, all that has been used to actually work against humanity. The bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki being a case in point. So these factors and led the writers, the playwrights, to ask a lot of questions, which is why when we look at plays that are written within what is called like a blanket term, and this blanket term also should not be accepted uncritically. So Martin Esslin, of course, in his very famous book, The Theatre of the Absurd, covers a lot of playwrights. And there are questions about whether all of them can be included within this or not. But what is aptly common to a lot of the playwrights, especially of the 1950s, late 1940s and 1950s, is this realization that the world is turning absurd. It is no longer making sense. And tied to this, I think, the point that you raised about the rhinos is very, very important and, in a sense, becomes a point of entry for us to understand not only the play Rhinoceros, but also the entire over, actually, of Ionesco's plays and of, the idea of the theatre of the absurd. Now, the rhinoceros is an animal. There is a play that is given the title of the animal. So, what has happened? Have we as human beings evolved further into being better, more civilized human beings? Or have we, in some ways, gone back and there is something animalesque that has now taken its place? So, this is a very important question because in terms of the theory of evolution, human beings are supposed to be more evolved. But why is it that suddenly Ionesco is now writing a play where the human beings are turning into rhinoceroses? So I think that for us becomes an important point of entry into a discussion of Ionesco's plays as well as the theatre of the absurd. And here I would request Professor Prakash to also share his views on these two very important questions that he has raised at the beginning.
Well, you have explained the two terms very lucidly, and they doesn't require any further explanation. But by way of extending the scope of the discussion, I might add that the drama has been in fact replaced by the theatre in the post Second World War situation, and as you rightly point out, that the world is not the same when the war ended. In fact, the war ended, but then the trend began of looking at the whole thing differently. So that way it became possible then to make endless experimentation on the stage, because there was nothing outside the stage, and who knows, as Shakespeare said, life is a stage, the world is a stage, and the 20th century people mean it literally. That the theatre is the place where action is happening, and you don't have to look out for anything. Just look at the stage and see the experiments that the theatre producer is making in the course of connecting with the audience, and you'll see that there's nothing outside. The whole world is contained on the stage, and the stage, particularly in the theatre of the absurd, would be a different kind of a stage. It will be totally vacant, as you suggested in the previous lecture on Samuel Beckett, that everything happens on the stage, and the stage is blank, and it's something that doesn't tell anything. It's a vacuous place. It's a place which is meaningless, and that idea, as you said, that 1940s are important. So that play was written in the 1940s, and maybe that broke ground for the theatre of the absurd in full in the early 1950s, when this play might have been conceived and executed by Ionesco.
Yes, that's true actually, and in fact I think one of the first plays that Ionesco writes is in 1948, and that's the Ball Soprano, and in this play, again, a lot of the questions and the play actually resonates very well with Samuel Beckett's Waiting for Godot. A lot of the concerns that are there in Beckett's plays are also concerns that are raised by Ionesco in a play like The Ball Soprano. But, I think, again, a very vital point that we need to take away here is about the transition from drama to theatre. And, in fact, that's where, I'm kind of going to begin with, a discussion today. So, this is a photograph of Eugene Ionesco from 1993, and he was born in 1909 and lived up to 1994. If we take a close look at this, these are some posters from the performances, of Rhinoceros, and it's important. It'll help us. It'll help the viewers visualize how is it that we can show this transition from the human beings becoming rhinoceroses on stage. So there were many ways that this was done. One was to actually just use sound and to, really speaking, not show any transformation on stage. But then there were other plays in which masks were used, and here are a few, photographs from a production that will help the viewers visualize how something like this could actually be achieved on stage. And as Professor Prakash rightly pointed out, that this transition from drama to theatre was very, very pointed, very significant in the 1950s. This is from, it's a poster of a film adaptation, very famous film adaptation of the play. Now, when we look at Ionesco's life, and I'll just speak very, very briefly about it, and to just indicate how Ionesco's growing up years were tied up with this idea of, the emerging Iron Guards and a certain kind of anarchy that he saw around him. And this anarchy was, for him, in his eyes, associated with a kind of collective formation, and which is why a kind of huge distrust of collectivity is something that we see in his works. So he was born to a French mother and a Romanian father, and he moved to places like Bucharest and Paris. His parents separated, and he did not have a very good relationship with his father because he never paid alimony to the mother, and she was no longer allowed to stay in Paris where he was. And that really, kind of had a deep impact on him. And so in Bucharest, he saw the Iron Guards and, great wave of, anti-Semitism there. And that really, really led to a certain sense of disillusionment in him. He says, and about his childhood memories, and especially vis-a-vis his parents, he says, I have the feeling that it is because of this memory that I hate authority, that this is the source of my anti-militarism. That is to say, of everything the military world is and represents, everything that is a society presided on a male's supremacy over women. Now, this is from his personal memoir, Present, Past, Past, Present, where he explains, when he looks back into his life, and these are snippets in a sense, it does not have like a coherent continuity, but he's also kind of looking back at certain events of his own life that led him to form certain opinions. Now, a question that we have already discussed, which is about the theatre of the absurd. Now, are there any characteristics of drama that are common to a lot of the plays that are written in this period? And when I say period, I largely mean the 1950s. So, do we look for a plot? Is there a sense of story? Is there a sense of an ending? Is there something that happens in the 1950s that actually takes away all these things, that there is no sense of a coherent plot? If we talk about a story, there is no, proper story in the conventional sense of it that we can really track. Ending, does something happen that gives us that sense of finality? No. Broadly speaking, no. We must remember that in this decade, we have some of the best plays of the 20th century, plays that are rooted in their time, and ones that we talk about all the time. There is a lot of research work that has happened on playwrights of the 1950s. So what is so significant about this period? And the point to be made here, and the point that we take away here, is that in the post-Second World War period, writers responded by negating, by saying no to all these things, that no longer was a plot possible, no longer was a story possible. And the reason being that the kind of fragmentation and the chaos that was there all along, it made it impossible for literature, for drama, for theatre to represent any kind of coherence. And that is where the idea of the absurd becomes very important, and the idea of the absurd comes in. It is a reflection of the times, and also represents the starkness of the stage, also represents, in a sense, the kind of starkness that is there in life, a sense of disillusionment that is taken up in a very significant way by the playwrights such as Eugene Ionesco, Samuel Beckett, and others. What, in this sense, are the characters doing on stage? So the characters represent individual existence or its breakdown in a sense of loneliness, a complete breakdown of communication. So how are the characters speaking to each other? If we actually look at the very first act of Ionesco, the very first scene, what we see is that there are conversations that are taking place simultaneously. And the playwright is presenting them not in terms of their logical conclusion, but how they are happening simultaneously and are, in a sense, kind of cutting into each other. And that prevents any attempt at understanding, or essentializing and summarizing that this is what two characters are really talking about. So, if there are characters such as tramps in Beckett's Waiting for Godot, then a lot of the characters here too represent a certain way of life. This also means that we have, a new way of looking at the protagonist. There is no longer a hero in the conventional sense of it. In fact, what we have is the anti-hero. So, for instance, when we, in this context, let us look at the characterization of Berenger, a character who actually belongs to four plays like The Killer, A Stroll in the Air, and Exit the King. It is in The Rhinoceros that we have a very, very powerful depiction of this character. And by powerful in the sense, a very clear delineation. But actually, if we look at the way in which the character is presented, Berenger's character is going to go against anything that we have in mind when it comes to a protagonist. So, we note that there is a kind of progression in the three acts, and the first act introduces us to a kind of social scene in which the society, people are trying to derive meaning out of their lives. So, for example, there is a logician who uses logic to get people to understand what things mean. But this is continually undercut with cross conversations to show how any kind of systemic structure is incapable of producing meaning. For instance, the logician talks about a hypothesis, talks about syllogisms, but nothing actually translates into using it and applying it to make sense of life. So the very first act introduces the question of how do you make sense of things. We then look at the two characters, Jean and Berenger. So one, Jean is, really speaking the cultured bourgeoisie, happy with his sense of meaning, and like all other believes that this is the only way in which meaning exists. Berenger, on the other hand, is unable to associate his existence, his identity with any of these structures, be it culture. In fact, he seems to be almost a kind of misfit. If we just take a look at this conversation between the two friends, Berenger, admires Jean for being extremely immaculate, whereas Jean, puts him down and says that your clothes are crumpled, you're a disgrace, you're a mess, your shoes haven't been touched, what a mess you are in. And Berenger, in a sense, is the protagonist. So, and Jean, a little later, with the sudden, visibility of the rhinoceros, says that he can't get over it. Whereas Berenger says that, yes, well, it was a rhinoceros, all right. It's miles away, and so on. But Jean says, it is fantastic. A rhinoceros loose in the town, and you don't bat an eyelid. It shouldn't be allowed. So, where everybody is trying to make sense of all these things, Berenger seems to be indifferent to it, and indifferent also to the other certitudes that people have established for themselves. So, in this sense, this characterization, this creation of a character like Berenger, I think fits in with the entire structure of the theatre of the absurd. And I'd request Professor Prakash here to, share his views on a character like Berenger.
You have used two words very centrally in your discussion. One is the meaning, and the other is plot. And in fact, the concepts are as old as the hills, because right from Aristotle, people have been struggling with making a distinction between life and art. And in the 20th century, as you suggest, literature has lost all meaning, and plot is not important. And a plot in the philosophical sense would mean that whenever you say something, you draw lines around yourself. The first line is language, the second line is the listener, and third line is the listener's need and your own need to share with that person. That is the plot. But in the 20th century, there is no communication between two individuals. There is no communication between an individual and his background. And there is nothing that can be said about life, because life has lost all sense of meaning. So it's I think, as you have pointed out, it's a wholesale attack on meaning. It's to observe life yourself, and without seeking meaning in it, one has to live. One has to draw up plans to spend time. And Beckett is a good example. Time was a problem for them. How to spend it? How to reach the end? And these writers in the early 50s and late 40s, they just do not know what to do with time. Time means life. Time means existence. Time means experiences. So all has lost, its sense and appeal. So that is what that is, hurting their minds, preoccupying them, just engaging them with things where things actually are only notions. Things are only, shades of or shadows of ideas, but not ideas in particular and concrete. So this is what we are up against, and this is what we have to contend with.
True, and also I think it's also one that meaning is no longer possible, and there is nothing that is certain. And this complete lack of, in a sense, what we call today the complete lack of a center in that sense, I think that is something that the playwrights capture very well. And, it is certainly a reflection of the mood. They're responding to what has happened. And this complete, the use of certainties to actually impact human civilization, I think that sense is very strong here. So all these people are unable, if we look at the logician, we look at Jean, who speaks of culture, nobody is able to explain the phenomena of the rhinoceros. And they're all very agitated about it. So at one point when Jean suggests, take advantage of what free time you have, the logician says, use a little method. And both ideas, in a sense, collapse. Take advantage of free time to make sense of things through culture, through the bourgeois way of life, or the logician's way of using method. So the next idea that emerges here is whether, when we say that there is no certainty, how is it depicted in this particular play? So the question that emerges is whether the rhinoceros is an Asiatic one, or is it an African one? Is it a one-horn rhinoceros? Is it a two-horn rhinoceros? And, it seems absolutely inane. The discussion is not leading anywhere. And the logician's statement that you have got away from the problem which instigated the debate. And he says, in the first place, you were deliberating whether or not the rhinoceros that passed by was the same one that passed earlier, or whether it was another. Now, this is a very important point, that when the rhinoceros passes, is it the same one, or are there more than one? And since they see these rhinoceroses for the first time, there's no way of telling. But this is not about the rhinoceroses. It is about the sense of time. And that, I think, is important here.
So, friends, in this part of the discussion, Professor Payal Nagpal has told us about the scheme of writing a play in the mid-20th century, and that gave birth to a kind of imagination that belonged to Ionesco in the middle of it. So, in the next stage of the discussion, Professor Payal Nagpal will be will be analyzing the structure, if at all there is a structure, of the play Rhinoceros. Thank you.